Hey everyone. All right, today we're going to be talking about the heart, chambers of the heart, blood pumping through and to the heart. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And hopefully you were able to check out the lab model videos by Dr. Peipel. Those should be posted there as well. So first, let's talk about where the heart sits in the body. So it sits in the thoracic cavity, technically in the mediastinum. It's surrounded by a sac called the pericardium. Remember our serous cavities. But it sits kind of to the left of the heart, or the left kind of sits to the left. If you notice, a kind of the bottom of the heart here, which is called the apex of the heart, is kind of pointing to the left. So it sits a little bit to the left, and it kind of has its own little notch in that left lung to accommodate for it. And the top of the heart we call the base of the heart. So I know that seems a little counterintuitive, the base being at the top of the heart. Is where all the vessels come out, and the bottom of the heart being the apex, because it kind of comes to this point, comes to an apex. So that's a good way to remember the different areas of the heart and where it sits. So what are the layers of the heart wall? So this is very similar to other layers that we've talked about, layers of muscle, layer of nerve, all those things, bone, so very similar. So the outermost layer is the epicardium. It's the visceral layer. So it's the visceral layer of the pericardium. So we said that we have the pericardial cavity, the pericardial sac. So part of that pericardium is attached directly to the heart. So if we look at our picture and we have the layers of the pericardium, remember our parietal versus visceral. So here's our parietal layer of the pericardium and that visceral layer of the pericardium. And there's that pericardial cavity, pericardial sac. So the epicardium is the same as that visceral layer of the pericardium, that outermost layer. And then the myocardium is the middle layer, myo for heart muscle. So myocardium is the middle layer. And then the endocardium is the innermost layer, and it's lining the chambers of the heart. So the heart chamber is lined by that endocardium. So speaking of chambers of the heart, what are our four different chambers? Well, you have the atria, which are the smaller chambers up near the base of the heart. So these guys are going to be receiving blood. So they're going to be receiving blood from the body and from the lungs, just depending on which side of the heart you're on. And that's the right atrium and the left atrium. And these guys send blood then to the ventricles. So the ventricles are the lower, larger chambers. So they're going to receive blood from the atria, and then they're going to send it out again to the body or to the lungs again, depending on which side you're on. And we'll talk about that later. So the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So the right atrium sends blood to the right ventricle, and the left atrium sends blood to the left ventricle. So this is just a good picture to show that. So usually we talk about the right side first. So right atrium, sending blood down to the right ventricle, and then that right ventricle sending the blood out to the lungs. Okay. And then we have our left atrium receiving blood back from the lungs, sending it to the left ventricle, and that left ventricle sending it up and out the aorta to the body. And we'll talk a lot more about blood flow through the heart in a little bit. So if you're looking at the heart model, how do we tell where these chambers are? Just looking at the model, if it's not, a good cross section of the heart, how do we know where we are? Well, if we orient ourselves with the vessels, so we can find our aorta and our pulmonary trunk, Okay, then we know we're on the anterior side of the heart. So if we're looking at the anterior side of the heart, then we know this is the right side, okay, and this is the left side. So we have an upper right atrium and a lower right ventricle. And if you notice, there's these vessels running kind of right down the middle, a little bit at a diagonal, and that essentially splits the ventricles. So anything on the right is all the right ventricle, anything on the left is all the left ventricle. Okay, and these little guys up here are called auricles. And these guys can tell you they're sitting right on top of those atria. So right atrium, left atrium. Don't you like my drawing? So now let's talk about the valves of the heart. We have 4 chambers of the heart and we have 4 valves. And we have 2 sets of valves. So our first type of valve is called an atrioventricular valve. And this is between the atria and the ventricles. So we have the tricuspid valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the bicuspid valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So you can also call the bicuspid valve the mitral valve, which is very commonly used. I like bicuspid because it tells you how many cusps or how many flaps the valve has. So tricuspid has 3, bicuspid has 2. Try and bi. So the other way to remember which one is which is we usually talk about the right side of the heart first. So you always try before you bi. So we tricuspid on the right side and bicuspid on the left side. Okay, it's a good way to remember it. Now our other set of valves are the semilunar valves. And these guys are between the ventricles and the great vessels. So the things that are exiting off the top of the heart. So that's going to be our aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So we have the aortic valve between the left ventricle and the aorta, and the pulmonary valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Okay. So essentially, the blood has to go through a valve between the chambers, and then it's got to go through a valve to exit the heart. Okay. So now let's find those chambers again, and now we can connect up our valves. So if we find our right atrium, we're going to go through the tricuspid valve to get to the right ventricle. So if we follow that blood flow, we're coming into the right atrium, through the tricuspid, and into the right ventricle. And then we're going to go out the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve, and out to the lungs. Okay. Then same on the left side, if we find our left atrium, blood coming in, it's got to go through the bicuspid valve to get to the left ventricle. And then the blood leaving the ventricle has to go out the aortic valve and then out the aorta to the body. Okay, so bicuspid and aortic on the left side. So what are some special structures in the ventricles? So this is found in both the right and the left ventricle. Okay, so we have an interventricular septum. It's essentially the muscle that divides the right and the left ventricle. So it's a wall or a barrier between the 2 ventricles. The chordae tendineae, so think cords, they're fibrous cords, and essentially what they do is they tack down those AV valves so the valves or those cusps don't fly back up into the atrium. So they tether them down, and that'll make a little more sense maybe when I show you a picture of what it looks like when those valves close. So it prevents backflow from the ventricles to the atria. And then we have papillary muscles where those chordae tendineae attach to the wall of the heart, of the ventricle. So they're little muscles that kind of pop out So they're like little mounds, and they are what are attaching those chordae tendineae. And then the trabeculae carnae are essentially just the irregular surface of the ventricle wall. So if you notice, it's not perfectly smooth. The atrial walls are a little smoother. So the ventricular walls definitely have this irregular surface. So it's kind of these bumps in the muscle of the wall. So let's take a look at those kind of weird structures, okay? So this is a different, it's the same model, but we've taken off the anterior structures so we can see into the chambers. Okay, so if you identify your different valves, we have our tricuspid pulmonary valve on the right, we have our bicuspid and aortic on the left. Okay, so now if we look at just the ventricles, we have some of these different structures. So that interventricular septum just essentially draws the line between the right and the left ventricles. So it's just a muscle part of the wall. And then we said we have these chordae tendineae, which essentially are just these little cords coming down and attaching that AV valve to the muscle or the wall of the ventricle. Okay, so it keeps these flaps from going back up and prolapsing up into the atria when the heart pumps. And then the little muscle, the little papillary muscle, it's this little mound here that essentially attaches to the chordae tendineae to keep those valves from prolapsing. And then the trabeculae carnae, just see these little ridge lines all along the wall of the ventricles. So they're just termed trabeculae carnae. Okay. So if we look at the blood flow through the heart, essentially it's a double pump, right? So they're pumping, it's pumping the right side and the left side simultaneously, okay? So if we follow it, we usually talk about the right side first, okay? And we're also going to talk a little bit about the oxygenation of the blood, okay? So if we start on the right side of the heart, okay, we're going to receive blood from the body. So everything coming back from the body is going to come into the right atrium through the vena cava. So we have the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. So it's going to drain all the blood from the body coming back to the heart. Okay. And then from that right atrium, it's going to go through that tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Okay. And then the heart's going to pump or squeeze all that blood out of the right ventricle and into the pulmonary trunk. And if you notice, the AV valve is now shut. So that's where those little chordae tendineae come in handy so that it doesn't flip back up into the atria. So then that blood goes out to the lungs, okay, because it's all deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood, right? It's coming back from the body and the body used up all the oxygen. So now it's got to go to the lungs, get reoxygenated, and then it comes back to the heart. So now we're going to come back to the heart into the left atrium. And they come back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Okay. So then it goes from the left atrium through the mitral valve to the left ventricle. And again, same thing, the left ventricle is now going to squeeze, right, simultaneously with the right side, but now we're just talking about the left side, and it's going to squeeze up through that aortic valve into the aorta and out to the body. So we get all that nice oxygen-rich blood out to the body. Okay, so then all in the body, we have all these different capillary beds and all the different tissues that are now going to get oxygenated. So now let's talk a little bit about blood vessels, and we'll talk a whole lot more about blood vessels in our blood vessel lab and lecture, but just to get an idea. So when we talk about arteries, we're talking about vessels that are running away from the heart. So arteries for away. And then when we talk about veins, these vessels are always going to be running towards the heart. Okay, so this is the standard rule. Arteries are going away, veins are going toward. Okay, now whether the arteries and veins are either oxygen poor or oxygen rich, usually we think of arteries as oxygenated blood or oxygen rich blood. Now we do have some exceptions to that, and those are the pulmonary arteries coming from that pulmonary trunk. So the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries are running away from the heart, so that qualifies, but they are carrying deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood back to the lungs to get oxygenated. Now, veins usually are carrying the deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood back to the heart. Okay. Now, our exception to this rule are the pulmonary veins, which are returning from the lungs. So they just got nicely oxygenated. So they are oxygen rich blood coming back to the heart. Okay. And if we go back, you can look through the blood flow again of the heart that we just talked about, and you can see those pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins and how they are a little bit different. Okay, and I want you guys to know that definitely for lecture. So the first set of vessels we're going to talk about associated with the heart are the arteries of the heart themselves. So these guys are going to come directly off the base of the aorta. So they're the first branches off that aorta, and they're going to come directly back to the heart muscle because the heart is working really hard to pump this blood throughout the body. So it needs the best and first oxygenated blood that's possible. So these are the coronary arteries. So the coronary arteries are super important, and they are the ones that are blocked during a heart attack. So we do have two coronary arteries, the right and the left coronary artery. And then there are a few branches off the coronary arteries. So we have marginal arteries, which are branches, and we'll see pictures of these guys. And then the interventricular arteries, which are continuations of the coronary arteries. So they start as the coronary artery and turn into the interventricular arteries. And essentially these guys are the ones that follow in that groove that delineated the difference between the left and the right ventricles. So hence the interventricular, or between the ventricles. These are the arteries that run in that groove. And this will make more sense in the pictures. And then the last artery that we'll talk about is the circumflex artery. And essentially the circumflex artery is a little bit special. It is a continuation or kind of a branch of that left coronary artery. And this will make more sense. It curves around the top side of the heart or the base of the heart. So a picture will definitely help with the circumflex artery. Then the veins of the heart, so these guys are the ones that are going to drain all the blood from the heart, that muscle, just used up all that good oxygen and is going to return it back to the right side of the heart and then eventually to the lungs, right, to get reoxygenated. So these guys, the biggest area is the coronary sinus. In the coronary sinus, we've talked about a couple different sinuses in the body. So, and one to compare it to would be the dural sinus in the brain. So a sinus just means kind of an enlargement of a vessel, okay? So the coronary sinus is only on the posterior side of the heart, and essentially it drains all the other veins. So it's the last exit or entrance into that right atria. So all these cardiac veins, the great, middle, and small cardiac veins, will make more sense on the picture, and they all drain or run into the coronary sinus and into the right atria. So let's take a look at that. So if we're looking at the model, we're looking at the anterior side of the model. And if we find our great vessels up here, we have our pulmonary trunk and our aorta over here. And then we have our left atria or atrium and right atrium, okay? And then if you notice, we said there's that big groove here that essentially gives us our right ventricle and left ventricle. So that's how we orient ourselves on the model. And then if you notice, we've got, let me change color here actually. Maybe what will show up? Blue. So we have one vessel coming off up here, and that's the right coronary artery. And then we have one coming right off under the pulmonary trunk, and that's the left coronary artery. Okay, so left coronary artery, right coronary artery. So then we have the right, if we follow the right coronary artery, we shoot off a branch right here. And that first branch is the right marginal artery, and it continues around to the back side of the heart, to the posterior side. So we'll leave that for right now, okay? So the right coronary artery gives off that right marginal artery. And then now let's come over to the left coronary artery. Left coronary artery is quite short, kind of comes under the pulmonary trunk, and then it's going to branch right away. So it branches, and the one that goes towards the left here is the circumflex artery. Okay, so there's the circumflex artery, which throws off a branch, and you guys guessed it, the marginal artery. So the left marginal artery, okay? Somewhere in there, that one. And then the other branch, so the continuation of the left coronary artery coming down this groove is the anterior interventricular artery, okay? So the interventricular artery on the anterior side. So we said there's that groove that separates the left and the right ventricles, and it runs right in that groove. So again, when we're talking about the arteries, they're all in red, okay? So they're all in red, and then we'll talk about the veins that are in blue, okay? So the only vein really on the anterior side that we can see is the great cardiac vein. So it's running right with the anterior interventricular artery, and it's then coming up here, and it's going to kind of run along with the circumflex artery to the posterior side of the heart. So now if we go to the posterior side, let's orient ourselves. So here, so we're looking at the posterior side. So here's our groove that splits the heart in half. Okay, here's our right atria. Here's our left atrium. And then that means this is our left ventricle and our right ventricle. Okay. So if we look right up at the top here, you see there's this big blue section, and that is the coronary sinus. So it's going to be draining all those cardiac veins. So that great cardiac vein coming from that left side, it was following that circumflex artery, and it's going to come around and drain into the coronary sinus. Now the middle cardiac vein is coming right from the groove, coming up and into the coronary sinus. And last but not least, we have that small cardiac vein coming from the right side and draining up into the coronary sinus as well. And the coronary sinus drains into that right atrium. Okay. So now let's go back to the artery side. So we said that right coronary artery kind of comes around the right side from the anterior side. Okay. It threw off that marginal artery, and it's going to continue as the posterior interventricular artery. Okay. So that's really the only important artery on the back side. So a lot more venous structures or veins on the posterior side, and a lot more arteries on the anterior side that we're kind of talking about. Okay. If you look on the left side, that's that marginal artery. So the marginal arteries on either side are really on the sides of the heart, to the left and the right sides. Okay. So it's kind of in between anterior and posterior, or marginal. So this picture kind of gives us a better idea. It kind of makes the heart see-through, so you can follow those pathways of the vessels a little bit easier. So if we look, here's that right coronary artery. Okay, and it's going to come all the way around the back side and become that posterior interventricular artery. Okay, so right coronary artery, and then the branch it gives off is that marginal artery. Okay, so now if we follow our left coronary artery, it kind of comes under that pulmonary trunk. Okay, and it doesn't last too long before it gives off that circumflex artery branch, which then follows around to the backside. Okay. And then it's going to continue, though, down and become the anterior interventricular artery. And this branch back here, that is that marginal artery as well, the left marginal artery, even though it's not labeled. Okay. So that is the arterial side. And what about the venous side? Okay, so we said a lot is happening on the posterior side. So we're starting kind of on the anterior side. So we have that anterior or great cardiac vein coming from the anterior side, and it's going, let me switch colors. So it's going to drain that front side, the anterior side, and then it's going to wrap all the way around to the back side. Okay, and drain into the coronary sinus. Everything's draining into the coronary sinus. There's the small cardiac vein, okay, coming around, draining the right side back to the coronary sinus, and that middle cardiac vein draining the posterior side and coming back to the coronary sinus, okay? So arterial, that's all going away or out and oxygenating that heart muscle, and then the coronary or the cardiac veins are draining that blood that's all used up, the oxygen, and it's going to drain it all back to the right atrium. So now let's talk about what happens once the blood leaves that left ventricle. So it's leaving the left side of the heart. It's bringing all that oxygenated blood to the body. So all these guys are going to be arteries, right? They're going to be going away from the heart. And the aorta is our biggest artery. So it's the very first artery leaving that left ventricle. And then we just talked about the coronary arteries that branch off the base of that aorta. But then we talk about different regions of the aorta. So when it starts going up, we call it the ascending aorta. And then it makes a little turn, and that's called the aortic arch. And we've got a few branches of arteries that are going to come off that arch. And again, this will make more sense when we look at a picture. So that first branch is going to be the brachiocephalic trunk. So the brachiocephalic trunk is then going to branch into two very important arteries going to the right side of the body. So this will be going to the right neck and the right arm, okay? So the brachiocephalic trunk becomes the right common carotid artery. We've heard the carotid artery before. And then it becomes and the other branch is the right subclavian artery. So we'll see these guys in the picture. So again, brachiocephalic trunk becomes the right common carotid and the right subclavian. So it branches, and these are all going to the right side of the body. And then the other two branches right off the aortic arch are going to the left side of the body. So this is going to be the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian. So let's see some pictures. So here's our model again. So right now, kind of ignore the pulmonary trunk. We're looking at the aorta. So this is our ascending aorta because it's going up. It's ascending. And then it's going to make a turn. And where it turns is called the aortic arch. Okay. So now our first branch, so the blood can go out any of these three branches, is going to be the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, going to the right side of the body. And then our second branch is going to be the left common carotid. Okay, so that's going to be going up the left side of the neck, and we'll talk about that. And then our last branch is the left subclavian. Okay, and that's going to go out to the left arm. So we talked about the brachiocephalic trunk having two branches now as well. So we'll see that in the next picture. So it's going to give off the right common carotid and the right subclavian. Okay. So here are those branches. So just a different picture instead of the model. So we have our ascending aorta, aortic arch. Okay. Our first branch is the brachiocephalic trunk, and then that's going to turn into, it's going to give off the right common carotid up the right side of the neck and the right subclavian out to the right arm. Our second branch is that left common carotid going up the left side of the neck. So these guys are both going to the brain. And then we have our left subclavian going to the left arm. Okay. So now we'll talk about those vessels that are returning to the heart. So these guys are the veins that are bringing in that deoxygenated blood returning to the right side of the heart. Okay, except our one exception, right? And we'll talk about the lung vessels in a second because they're the ones that screw everything up. But in general, our veins are the ones returning with deoxygenated blood. So the vena cava. So the vena cava, all blood returning to the heart from the body is going to go through either the superior or inferior vena cava. So the superior vena cava, so superior meaning above, so it's going to drain anything kind of from the upper body and the head. So anything kind of above the heart. Okay. So that's going to be our internal jugular vein, subclavian vein, and brachiocephalic vein. Okay, if you notice, some of these guys are named very similarly to the arteries, so that'll help us out a little bit. The inferior vena cava drains all the lower body, so everything from the heart and below, essentially. Okay. So here's our picture. So we have our right atrium. Okay, so superior vena cava is going to be above, and then our inferior vena cava is going to be below. So if we look at our torso, okay, this is a different kind of model. Just imagine the heart is sitting in this space here, right? Maybe a little bigger than my circle. But let's look at some of these models, these veins that are coming back to the heart, okay? So if we find our aorta, we talked about that one. So right next to that is our superior vena cava. So it's draining everything from the head and the upper body. So we have our brachiocephalic vein, okay, there, and then also here. So this is also brachiocephalic, both sides, okay, brachiocephalic vein. Okay. And then we have our subclavian veins. These guys are coming from the arms. Okay, and they're going to turn into the brachiocephalic vein. So here's our subclavian over here coming in, and it's going to drain into the brachiocephalic. Okay. And then we have our internal jugulars, so draining the head. Okay, and they're going to come run all the way. All of these are going to run into that superior vena cava and back to the right atrium. So I think I like this Flatman model a little bit better. So you're able to see the vena cava up here coming into the right side, and it's going to drain our subclavian and our internal jugular into the brachiocephalic, into the superior vena cava. Okay, so same thing, here's our subclavian, internal jugular, they join brachiocephalic, and then they're going to be the superior vena cava. Okay. But we can also follow out those aortic, the arteries if we want to as well. So we have our aortic arch. Then we have that first branch, which is our brachiocephalic trunk, which gives off that internal carotid or common carotid, and then the subclavian. Okay. And then going to the left side, we have our common carotid, left common carotid, and then our left subclavian going out to the left arm. Okay, so I like this Flatman model. He's pretty good for all of these vessels coming in and out of the heart. So those were vessels leaving the heart going to the body or coming from the body coming back to the heart. So now we're going to talk about the vessels that are coming to and from the lungs, okay, to the heart. So that pulmonary trunk, so the pulmonary trunk is the one coming from the right ventricle. Okay, so remember that pulmonary valve, okay, one of our semilunar valves. So this guy is going to branch into the pulmonary arteries. So that's why we don't call it the pulmonary artery, we call it the pulmonary trunk, because it's going to then branch into multiple, actually two large pulmonary arteries. And these guys have deoxygenated blood, right? So all that deoxygenated blood was just returned from the right side, the right atrium, right? From all the rest of the body through the vena cavas. It's all used up, right? So now we got to go to the lungs. So we go through the pulmonary arteries and out to the lungs, okay? Again, right? Pulmonary artery, you're going away from the heart. And then we go to the lungs, we get oxygenated, and then we're going to come back through the pulmonary veins. So the veins are always going to be returning to the heart, but these guys are now oxygenated. Okay, so they're going to come back to that left atrium. So let's look at that. So let's find our pulmonary trunk coming off that right ventricle. Okay. So the blood's going to leave that. So we just returned through the vena cava to the right atrium, and the right atrium to the right ventricle. Now the right ventricle out the pulmonary trunk to those pulmonary arteries. Okay, so one's going to go under the aorta and this way, because we have two lungs, right? So essentially one is going to the right lung, one is going to the left lung. Okay, so we have two big pulmonary arteries. Okay. Out to the lungs, we get oxygenated. Now we're going to come back through those pulmonary veins. So we have a couple pulmonary veins on either side, and they are all going to empty into that left atrium. Okay. Now they're nicely oxygenated. They go through the left ventricle and then out into the aorta, out to the body. Okay. Again, beautiful drawing. So here's yet another picture, because I like this picture to kind of show you the pulmonary arteries and veins. So we have the trunk, pulmonary trunk, splitting into the left and right pulmonary arteries going out to the lungs. And anything pulmonary, right? It has to do with the lungs. So pulmonary arteries going out, carrying that deoxygenated blood, going out, getting oxygenated in the lungs, and then they're going to return via the pulmonary veins. So again, you see 2 on this side and 2 on this side, but they're all going to come back to that left atrium. Nicely oxygenated, then it can go out to the rest of the body via the left side. So let's go back to our flat man model. We've talked about all these body vessels. Now we're going to talk about the pulmonary vessels. So if we start, here's our pulmonary trunk. We're going to split to the right and the left pulmonary arteries going out to each lung. They're going to branch further and further into these smaller and smaller vessels, finally into the capillaries. That's where all the oxygen exchange is happening out in the lung tissue. So now we're going to be oxygenated, and now we're going to return back through the pulmonary veins. So multiple pulmonary veins coming in the right and the left side, okay, because we have the right and the left lung, but it's all going to end up in that left atrium. Okay. Now we're nicely oxygenated and we can go out to the body. So to finish up, we'll talk a little bit about the remnants of fetal circulation. So what does fetal circulation mean? So think about a fetus, right? A developing fetus sitting in utero. What is it living in? It's living in fluid, right? So does it use its lungs? Nope, it does not. So it's not breathing, right? So it's not breathing, it's not utilizing the lungs. So what the heart does in the fetus is it tries to bypass the lungs altogether, because why waste energy sending the blood out to the lungs to get oxygenated when there's no oxygen there to oxygenate the blood? So where does that blood get oxygenated? Well, it's in utero, so the umbilical vessels. Okay, and we'll talk all about that in our circulatory lecture. But essentially it doesn't need the lungs, right? So we're going to shunt all of the blood from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart, just bypassing the lungs altogether. So in the fetus, we actually have a hole. So there's a hole in between the 2 atrium. So it shunts the blood from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart, from the right atrium to the left atrium, through this hole called the foramen ovale. So in the fetus, it's called the foramen ovale. But when we take our first breath, that hole is going to, it's a flap, and essentially it's going to close. But we have this kind of depression in the atrium still. So you can actually see this depression in the wall of the atrium, and that depression is called the fossa ovalis. Okay. So it's a fetal remnant, meaning that there used to be a hole there, but now it's just a depression. So that's our remnant number 1, is the fossa ovalis, because it used to be the foramen ovale. Okay. Now our remnant number 2 is a ligament. Okay. So again, we had a way to shunt the blood from the right side to the left side. If the blood bypassed that hole, still went into the ventricles, so say it went into the right ventricle, now it's going to come out that pulmonary trunk, but we don't want it to go to the lungs. So essentially there was a vessel connecting the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So then hopefully some of the blood's going to get shunted from that pulmonary trunk out to the aorta and bypass the lungs altogether. So when we take our breath, and that structure, that vessel, sorry, is called the ductus arteriosus. So that is the little vessel connecting that pulmonary trunk to the aorta in the fetus. So now we're not a fetus. We take our first breath, we close that foramen ovale, and then essentially we're going to start using those lungs. And so this structure starts to shrivel up. So we are no longer shunting blood from the right to the left side. So essentially it becomes a ligament. So it shrivels up, it's no longer a duct or a tube, and it just shrivels up into a ligament. So we call it the ligamentum arteriosum. So the ligamentum arteriosum is our second fetal remnant structure. Okay? And I think that's it for this lab. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Okay? All right, until next time, stay safe.